Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 105 of the Declutter Hub podcast. I'm Ingrid.
And I'm Leslie.
If you have clutter and want to sort it out, this is the show for you. Now, in today's episode, Leslie and I are talking about baking equipment. We had a request from one of our Facebook group members if we could do a podcast about this topic. So here we go, Leslie. So my first question, did you do and bake banana bread in lockdown?
No. In actual fact, I'm not going to lie, you and I are probably the worst people in the world to do a podcast about baking equipment because unless I'm wrong, neither of us are bakers.
I know.
We're going to try, aren't we? Because we do have clients that are bakers and so we have an experience of it. But maybe we won't demonstrate the love of baking that a lot of our listeners will have.
Yes, I think you're kind of hit the nail on the head here, Leslie. I don't think I've ever been a baker. You know, even when I was young, like my friends were like experimenting in the kitchen and baking Dutch apple pies and doing grandmother's cakes, and there's me kind of going, yeah, let me give that a try. And I think I baked an apple pie 3 times and I thought, okay, this is a lot of work. I don't know if I want to do this. So I've never really been into baking, but I do like eating cake.
I think that therein lies the problem for me because I've continually been on a perpetual diet since I was about 25. And I know that if I make the cake, I'll eat the cake. So therefore, I don't make the cake. But yeah, absolutely. If someone else is baking it for me, then I eat the cake.
Yeah. So, I mean, completely off topic, Leslie, but what's your favorite cake? Because I want to know now, of course.
Oh, carrot cake for sure. Carrot cake.
Really?
Yeah.
That would be my least favorite cake.
Do you know, I think most of it is because of the beautiful topping, you know, the icing on a carrot cake. I love that because I love really sweet things. No, I do. Yeah, carrot cake's my favorite. Definitely.
Right. I think we found something that Leslie and I actually don't agree upon. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes. Now, I actually don't like carrot cake at all. And I don't like banana bread either. So I did not make it during lockdown either. But a nice Victoria sponge, that definitely, or like a nice piece of freshly baked grandmother's cake or Dutch apple pie. Yeah. Definitely.
Making me hungry now. You know, we're supposed to be recording a podcast and you're making me want to go out and buy an entire carrot cake or Victoria sponge that I can eat. Right. So what words of wisdom have we got about baking equipment, Ingrid?
Well, you're absolutely right, Leslie. A lot of people love baking and they're really good at it as well. And some people, they love it, but they never do it. They've got all the stuff there, but they never get around to it. And some people have all the stuff, but they just think, one day I'm going to make all these beautiful cakes. So there's quite a lot involved with baking, isn't it? You think, oh, it's just a couple of muffins, but we know from experience it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
I think people fall into 3 categories, don't they, in the baking world. They're either like you and I, where we might have a couple of things that we've got hung over from when we were baking with our children or whatever. And then there are those people, as you very rightly say, that like the idea of baking and have got a lot of residual equipment knocking around, but don't quite ever get around to it. And then you've got people who live, eat and breathe baking, who've got lots of equipment, maybe too much, maybe just enough. And so people definitely fall into different categories. And so who are we going to be talking about? Are we going to try and cover everybody today?
Yes, Leslie. I think we're going to try and cover all bases here. But let's first then talk about kind of the bits and bobs that knock around in people's kitchens, because it's not just the cookbooks, isn't it? It's not just a couple of aprons and a couple of tins. I mean, I actually Googled and I kind of went, okay, just to remind myself, what kind of baking equipment? And there was just spatulas and bowls and whisks and thermometers and cutters. And I was like, oh my gosh, the list was getting a bit endless. And that's just the non-food stuff. It's the cooling racks and the rolling pins. And we also have the food itself, like the flour and the food coloring and the vanilla extract and the yeast and the sugar and the powder. And so it's like different things you need to actually do baking in the first place. It's all the equipment, but it's also the food itself, isn't it?
You know what I would say about it, that most baking equipment, whether it's non-food or food, has got in common is it's pretty much always really awkward shapes.
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's little bottles or cookie cutters that are very difficult to store, or mixing bowls are kind of okay because you normally can put those into one another, but awkward looking spatulas or food processors and mixers, and so they're kind of awkward and they take quite a lot of space. And so I think the thing is with baking equipment, you have to be super organized, you have to keep it to a minimum, and you have to know that you absolutely are going to use it.
Yeah. And also with the food, Leslie, then you have to keep a look on those dates at that packaging. I mean, especially flour can go off a little bit sooner than you might expect. And you definitely do not want to have weevils in your flour. So that is something you really want to keep an eye on. I mean, sugar normally doesn't have a date. I think that's one of the only things that doesn't have a date, but everything else does keep dates on. So if you haven't been baking in a long time and actually want to do some again, check those dates on those products before you kind of go all out and have everything ready to go and then find out that your flour has been out of date for like 4 months.
Do you know what? I think that as declutterers, then we do tend to spend a lot of time, don't we, throwing out old baking equipment. But the real culprits for me, the ones that really cause problems, are things like food colouring and icing, kind of ready-made icing, that kind of thing, because they've got quite short lives of them. Now, some people will probably say, actually, food colouring is fine and it'll last for years and years. But I'm always a little bit like, I'm not sure whether I'd be wanting to eat something that was years out of date. And it is quite often years out of date when we find it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, especially and also there's little tubes of icing, that were bought like for a birthday cake 2 years ago. And they always kind of get stuck at the back of the cupboard because you don't use them all the time. And then when you get everything out, it's like, I didn't even remember that was there, Ingrid. Let's look at that. Oh my gosh, that was for this birthday cake that I made 4 years ago.
I know. It's awkward, isn't it? It's very awkward. And one thing, it definitely, with these little awkward things, containerization is definitely key, isn't it? You definitely need to containerize those little bits and bobs of food colouring and icing and all that kind of stuff. But before we get to the containerization, Ingrid, let's talk about some of the issues then, let's call them, that people have with baking equipment.
I think we first need to chat about realism, Leslie. I mean, if you have a lot of baking equipment, look at yourself in your kitchen, look at your life and go, how often do I actually bake cakes? Is this a once a year thing? Is this only a birthday cake once a year? Is this maybe only scones for Christmas? Is this kind of, or are you like in your kitchen every week baking another cake, trying out a new recipe, loving all different kinds of cakes, and you give it away to other people and you bring it to people when you go for a coffee? I mean, what's happening in your life here? What you need to look at is it in balance? Does the amount of baking stuff you have make sense to the amount you bake? Of course, if you bake more, you will have more stuff. But if you only kind of realize now, you're listening to this and thinking, you know what, I make muffins twice a year with the kids. You probably need a muffin tin and some cupcake cases, and that's it. So do the two kind of line up with each other. I think that would be my starting point, Leslie.
Absolutely. I'm not going to lie, Ingrid. I am struggling to get past the scones at Christmas. I'm like, is this just me, or is scones a thing that you make at Christmas? Did you just randomly throw that in there?
I mean, I always go home for Christmas, so I don't know. We don't have scones, but I thought, when would people bake? I thought, maybe they have scones with Christmas. I would like scones with Christmas, actually. Do you have scones with Christmas?
I don't think so. I feel like scones is like a summer thing, like jam and clotted cream. I don't know. But anyway, if anybody else has scones at Christmas, I can't let Ingrid go by saying things like scones at Christmas. But hey, I'm sure people do have scones at Christmas. But it's more like a Christmas cake, maybe.
Christmas cake. Okay.
Christmas pudding, not scones. But hey, I'm sorry to pick you up on that because you're making a very, very sensible point about realism that I'm going to come back to, of course, now that I have picked you up on your strange.
Maybe I just fancy a high tea, going out for a high tea. I've been stuck indoors so long. Maybe I just fancy high tea. And the first thing is like, oh, I would love a scone with some clotted cream and some jam. Maybe that's my ideal day out at the moment.
I think so. Anyway, just going back to, you're absolutely right. It's all about being realistic. As with anything, so the baking equipment, ultimately, for most people, the reason why we're talking about it is it's become a hobby. We don't actually have to bake, so I don't bake and I get away quite easily in my life without baking. So baking for most people becomes a hobby, doesn't it? And so it's about evaluating that hobby and seeing whether the equipment that you've got is serving you well, particularly if you're compromised on space. And so if you're struggling for space, are you giving loads and loads of your very precious cupboard space up to quite awkward, as we've already mentioned, baking equipment that you're not using?
Yeah, I think so too. Or maybe you've now realized by listening to me and Leslie chatting about this, like, I used to bake a lot, but actually I don't anymore. And I used to bake with the kids and they've now left home and it's not something that I really fancy doing anymore. So you've got kind of a leftover of those times past, but you're so right, Leslie. It's awkward. It's bulky. It's always either round when it should be square, or it's rectangular and doesn't fit anywhere properly. And it does eat up cupboard space like crazy. So if you have a lot of baking stuff, maybe that's a really good place to start.
I mean, if you want to store your baking equipment nicely, you have to spread it out over several cupboards is the bottom line, don't you? Yeah. So ultimately what happens for most people is that you kind of stuff it in a little bit because it's very hard to store. I think one of the things that I wanted to mention is we just love it because it's cute, isn't it? A lot of baking equipment, little flowery things and dotted things. And so there's loads of really lovely. So it's aspirational from that perspective because it looks so lovely that we can't leave it behind. So when we shop, quite often, if we are a baker, that's the kind of thing that we will pick up. And that's where the problems come. We've got someone in our membership at the moment who's like, but it's all so beautiful and I just want to keep it all. And that is not unusual. Very similar to crafting, isn't it? Where people can't leave things behind because they're so beautiful. So that causes problems as well. And so you have to try not to get taken in by the cutesiness of baking stuff as well, don't you?
Yeah. And I think also, because so many people love it, you can really get nice things as well. Not only pretty or cute stuff, but I think people probably who do kind of bake on a regular basis upgrade their equipment and upgrade their tins, and they get maybe a better brand, or they get gifts where people think, they love baking. Let me go and get them some nice stuff and get them some nice tins and get them some nice, I don't know, brushes. So you upgrade your equipment, but in the end you might go back to the one tin that is maybe very kind of old and kind of has seen a lot of life, but that cake turns out really, really well if you use that kind of equipment. So if you upgrade, can you let go of some of the stuff that's getting maybe old and falling apart, but you trust to do the job properly?
I know it's a tough one, isn't it? Because people who can bake well have got very specific things, as you say, very specific pieces of equipment that absolutely work every time, but they don't want to let go of. But those same pieces of equipment might have little bits of rust on them. They might have little bits of caked on food stuff on them. So sometimes they don't look great, do they? So they're old and worn, but they're doing the job. So what we do is we try and find something else that is going to do that job just as well. And sometimes it might take several bites of the cherry until you find that perfect piece that's going to replace that thing that you've had for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, isn't it?
It's you mentioned crafting a minute ago, and I was just thinking, because people who craft normally have lots of different projects on the go, but if you kind of ask them and say, okay, but what are you working on at the moment? What do you really still enjoy doing? Then they can say, oh, I don't knit anymore. I don't crochet anymore. I used to do that, but now I'm doing so and so. And I think with baking, it can possibly be the same thing. They maybe started off with muffins and had every intention of doing a whole, maybe even a small muffin business, and got all of the paraphernalia. But now they maybe have completely changed tack and make other types of cakes, and they don't need all of those muffin tins and all of those things that used to go with that certain type of baking anymore. So I think that's where the realism and the space come in as well. Have a think through what you actually bake.
You're absolutely right, Ingrid, that there are trends in baking as well. So if we go back 10 years, we weren't finding vegan cakes and gluten-free cakes and different types of cupcakes, and there's so many different types of cake now, and so the trends will change as well, and what people love to do develops over time. But we have to be, it's all about, ultimately, if you've got a huge kitchen with lots of space for your baking equipment and you feel that you go to that with regularity, there's no reason for you to declutter that. It's when you're having to compromise on space for cups and plates and glasses and things that you need every day. But baking stuff, that's when there's a problem.
Yeah, I think so too, Leslie. And I think if it is a very important hobby, normally, of course, hobbies can be put in other parts of the house, right? So you can have a spare room where you have a crafting, or you can make maybe a reading nook in one of your bedrooms upstairs or in your living room. But of course, baking has to happen in the kitchen. You need to be close to your sink and to your oven and to your... There's not a lot of people who have a whole separate prep kitchen somewhere. I'm not thinking back about the episode you did last week with Shalina, where they have like a prep kitchen and a fancy kitchen. And I was thinking, wow, this is nice. I don't think I know anybody who's got a prep kitchen. And of course, if you bake a lot, all this stuff you have to have close at hand. So you can't just store it in a completely different part of the house and keep walking back and forward. So you have to do compromising.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen a couple of times is that if people are known and have got a reputation as a baker, then people will ask them to bake multiple cakes for events. And so sometimes people are keeping multiple cake tins for that very reason. Now, in that instance, that's the kind of thing that I would consider to be kind of seasonal maybe. And that kind of stuff could then potentially go into a utility room, into a different cupboard, into a loft, into a garage, something like that. It's not ideal to put things like that into a garage because it tends to be damp and then it's going to rust. But it's something that people can consider to have like an overflow box of baking equipment for those kind of party cakes that you're making.
Yes, indeed. Point well made. I think I'm just thinking, my friend Heidi, she's a fantastic cake maker, and she occasionally makes the most beautiful cakes, but I think she does it more really like a hobby, but not all the time. But I mean, she does make the most beautiful cakes. I'm a bit jealous. I'm not going to lie, Leslie. I'm a bit jealous of people who can, when you see these pictures and they're like, I've made a cake for my daughter's 6th birthday. You see this beautiful rainbow cake. And I'm like, oh, that's something I'm not good at. That is something I'm not good at.
I know. I completely agree. I'm never going to be good at it. There's no point in me even. I'm just going to stick to what I know best, which is decluttering, which I'm very good at. Baking is not my thing, but decluttering definitely is. So we've talked then about realism, and I think we've made the point really that you have to be realistic about what you're actually doing. Really take a look and say, how often am I using this stuff? We've talked about whether the fact that things are aspirational. So is it, oh, I really, really want to spend time baking with my kids and that's why I'm keeping it, or I do want to take that up as a hobby at some point. It's also aspirational in terms of we love it because it's cute and lovely, they're just beautiful things, aren't they? You only have to go into somewhere like Lakeland to have a look around, and it's gorgeous, Of course, who's going to leave that behind if you love it? And we've talked a bit about compromise as well. And I think compromise is really what we're here then as declutterers to talk about more, isn't it? Which is, if you want to keep your baking equipment in a really nice, orderly way, what are you going to compromise on in the rest of your kitchen?
Yes. And I think also if you are doing some decluttering, think about where you want to store it in your kitchen. Because if this is I bake once a month or once every quarter, that stuff doesn't have to be in a premium space cupboard. It can be put maybe in a corner cupboard somewhere, or maybe somewhere up high where you can't easily reach it because you don't bake very often. If you are a bake weekly baker, then this stuff has to be easily at hand. So it's easy for you to grab it, and it doesn't become a chore just to get the equipment in and out of your kitchen cupboards.
Yeah. So that compromise might be just, yes, I'm going to keep it, but it's going to go high up, and it's not going to go at eye level. So things like that are important as well.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I did want to say briefly about decluttering is, I know I have no expertise as a baker, but one of the things that I've seen with the clients that I've worked with is that people don't like the silicone that was a trend a few years ago. So silicone baking trays definitely came in probably 10, 15 years ago. And what I see more often than not now is that people are offloading that silicone, whether it is baking cases or whether it is a silicone cake tin. It's not tin, but cake thing. I don't know what it's not a tin, because it's not tin, but it's a silicone baking thing.
Mold,
maybe I don't know. We don't need to know the names of things, do we? We just need to know whether they need to be decluttered or not. But yeah, so silicone, so a lot of people keep hold of that as well, and then over time, I've not used that silicone for years, so maybe that's something to look at. Or maybe you're a silicone lover, and it might just be the people that I've worked with that are not.
All right. The last thing I want to mention is recipes. You might, as a baker, have recipes that have been down through the generations. You might have some favorite things that you've seen online that you've printed. You might use some recipes from a cookbook with desserts where you thought, oh, that's great, I want to keep that. If you'd like to know more about cookbooks and recipes, we did one of the questions in our 100th podcast all about decluttering recipes. So do have a listen in if you want to know more about how to do that. Leslie, that's it for this episode. So thanks everyone for listening. And if you are inspired to take action and have a sort through your baking equipment, please come and share it in our fabulous Facebook group, the Declutter Hub community. We would love to see some before and afters there about your decluttering project. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with other people. Maybe your friends and family would love our show too. On our show notes page on our website, you can find all the sharing buttons. And if you want to have more handy tips and advice from us, you can find us in lots of places. We have the Facebook group, we've got a Facebook page, and we are on Instagram, Twitter, as well as at Declutter Hub, and we'd love to see you there. If you'd like to know more about our membership, do have a look on members.declutterhub.com to find out more. If you don't want to miss the next episode, subscribe to the Declutter Hub podcast, and it will pop into your notifications each Friday. We've been asking for reviews, which have made a huge difference to us. So if you've enjoyed today or any of our other podcasts, we would love you to take a couple of minutes out of your day to leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration, and don't forget to tune in next week.